Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members. I appreciate the opportunity to lay this out. The state of Texas is divided into 16 regional water planning areas with regional water planning groups that prepare water plans on 5-year planning cycles. At the end of each planning cycle, these plans are submitted to the Texas Water Development Board for approval, and then they're included in the newest state water plan. The Water Development Board can direct SWIFT funds only for use on those projects that have been included in the obviously very important state water plan. With the establishment of SWIFT, the importance of regional water planning groups has really grown immensely, and it's critical that the regional planning process be open and transparent for the sake of efficient and effective future planning and for public participation in how the state's resources and finances are used. While the Texas Water Development Board rules require that regional water planning groups be held in accordance with the Open Meetings Act, that's just a rule of the Water Development Board, and there's evidence that some regional water planning group committees have not followed these requirements. Similarly, there are questions regarding the obligation of regional water planning groups to provide documents to requesters under the Public Information Act. And this legislation would ensure that the Texas Open Meetings and Public Information Acts apply to these groups and their subcommittees. And the committee substitute clarifies that it also includes subcommittees. That's the difference. Members, the very first section of the Public Information Act says, and I'm going to quote, "The people insist on remaining informed so that they may retain control over the instruments they have created. This chapter shall be liberally construed in favor of granting a request for information." End of quote. That's a very strong statement. The people have the right to know about their government's affairs, and in close cases, requests for information shall be granted. SB 407 seeks to restore this right, which has been seriously compromised as a result of a recent Texas Supreme Court decision known as the Boeing case, and generally referred to as the Boeing case. Boeing reinterpreted the competition or bidding exception in Section 552.104 of the Act. This section currently provides that information is accepted from required disclosure, and here's the language, if it is information that, if released, would give advantage to a competitor or bidder. For over a decade, the Attorney General interpreted this exception narrowly. The AG held that only governmental bodies could raise this exception and that they had to show a specific competitive harm in a particular ongoing competitive bidding situation. Of course, this made sense in light of the legislative intent language I began with, and the fact that private parties can raise other exceptions like the trade secrets exception that's included in the Act. Nevertheless, the Supreme Court overruled the AG on both of these points in Boeing. In so doing, the court expanded the Public Information Act's competition or bidding exception in two ways. First, they allowed private entities to claim the exception as opposed to just the governmental entity. And two, they allowed the exception to apply when virtually any showing of harm is made. In essence, these changes transformed the competition or bidding exception into a second, very lax trade secrets exception. This expanded exception allows private entities profiting from public funds to shield basic information like price, because at some point in the future, maybe they may compete for the work again. SB 407 would undo this damage by limiting the competition or bidding exception to those cases when a governmental body demonstrates that the release of information would harm its interests in a particular competitive situation. Furthermore, Senate Bill 407 explicitly states the exception does not apply to final government contracts. And the committee substitute makes one clarifying change. It revises the first phrase in subsection C to clarify that this subsection does not affect other Public Information Act exceptions or confidentiality provisions. The private entities will have those, and we wanted to make sure that it didn't look like we were wiping those out at the same time. Members, this bill also addresses a recent decision from the Texas Supreme Court that I believe is very problematic for the Public Information Act. This case is commonly known as the Greater Houston Partnership case, and in it, the Supreme Court redefined which private entities have to comply with the Act. Section 552.003 of the Act currently defines governmental body to include, and I'm going to quote this, the part section, or portion of an organization, corporation, commission, committee, institution, or agency that spends or that is supported, and this is key, in whole or in part by public funds. Like the competition or bidding exception, the AG had a decades-old interpretation of this provision. It followed what was known as the Kneeland test, which came from the Fifth Circuit in 1988. The Kneeland test essentially holds that a private entity must comply with the Public Information Act if, 1, it receives public funds, unless the funds are received pursuant to an arm's length contract for services, like hiring a consultant or a lawyer or something of that nature. 2, receives public funds under a contract that indicates a common purpose or creates an agency-type relationship with the public entity. Or 3, receives public funds to provide services traditionally provided by a governmental body. That's the Kneeland test that has been in effect since 1988 and used for decades by the Attorney General. And despite that precedent and the statutory text, and again I want to quote it, that spends or that is supported in whole or in part by public funds, the Texas Supreme Court said a private entity or a portion thereof must comply with the Public Information Act only if it is sustained by public funds, which is a much higher threshold and frankly seems to ignore the text of the Public Information Act. Senate Bill 408 corrects this problem by codifying the Kneeland test. This test worked well for decades because it recognizes that the public has a right to know how public funds are spent, even when the government uses privatization to complete its work. Mr. Chairman, the committee substitute makes a few clarifications to the bill, all of which are consistent with Kneeland. The substitute adds the language in 552.002, which clarifies that if a private entity doing public and private work qualifies as a governmental body under the Act, then only the information that relates to the public work is considered to be public information under the Act, not everything that goes on, just that they're dealing with the public aspects. The substitute also tweaks the language in section 552.003(1)(a) in that section to better align the text with Kneeland. And finally, in subsection C, the substitute adds language to clarify that a private entity has to receive public funds or resources in order to qualify as a governmental body. It was always my intent that a private entity only qualifies if it receives public funds or resources, but that phrase was inadvertently left out of section C, and so we've put it in. Mr. Chairman, Mr. Gordon is also here as a resource witness on that.
And that's where